Materials supplied by Microsoft Corporation may be used for internal review, analysis, or research only. Any editing, reproduction, publication, rebroadcast, public showing, internet, or public display is forbidden and may violate copyright law.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and I want to go ahead and formally introduce Filip Skakun, right?
Filip Skakun, yeah.
Skakun, Filip Skakun, and he's going to go ahead and give kind of the details on where he works, kind of already has for those of you that got here on time, and he's going to be talking about a toolkit that he made using XAML. I think that you'll learn, if you're a XAML person, I think you'll learn a lot through his implementation of XAML in order to make this toolkit. Instead of just writing app-level code, app-level logic, if you take a step back, one abstraction away, and you write yourself control toolkits and control packs and stuff like that, then you're actually going a long ways toward being able to reuse that elsewhere. So it's always a good idea. So anyway, I'm excited to hear from Filip.
So hi, my name is Filip Skakun, and I'm a developer on the FreshPaint team at Microsoft. It's part of Microsoft Startup Business Group, which is part of Microsoft Research. I've been on the FreshPaint team for 3 months now. Previously, I worked for another company called Vectorform, and I worked back and forth at Microsoft and Vectorform a couple times already. So I started at Microsoft 7 years ago on the SQL Server team. Then going back and forth, I worked on Windows SDK, Xbox Live, and Microsoft Retail, Microsoft Surface, the original one. Actually, my adventure with XAML started building applications with WPF and for Microsoft Surface, the original big-ass table. And then I also worked at Microsoft CRM building Windows Phone application. And then I've done some more contracting, building applications for companies like CNN, ESPN, Nokia, Microsoft, Disney, Sesame Street, AccuWeather, a couple others probably. And now I'm at the FreshPaint team, and I still use XAML and usually do that together with DirectX to some degrees. So that's what I do at work, but in my free time, since I've been developing on Windows 8 for like 2 years now, about a year and a half ago, I decided that a lot of the things that you want to do on Windows 8 requires controls and behaviors that are not available out of the box in the Windows 8 APIs. So since I started building my own toolkit, at some point I decided to start sharing it on Codeplex. So I've been building controls and extensions and tools in the WinRT XAML Toolkit for 1 year and a half now, and they're on Codeplex, where you can download them as source code, and also available on NuGet. So if you need some of these tools that I will show today, you can just go to your package manager in Visual Studio, and in a few seconds you can have my library as part of your solution. So WinRT XAML Toolkit is the name of the library. So it's a library of reusable solutions to recurring problems, and that's actually proven to be really, really true, because most of these things that are in that library I've used in at least 2 or 3 different projects that I worked on. And the library has controls. So there's a list of controls that I custom implemented just out of some quirky ideas, or just to test some theories. Some of them are implementations of controls that are not available in Windows 8, but were available in either WPF or Silverlight. Some of them are actually ported controls from the Silverlight toolkit that you had on in Silverlight 3 or 4 or 5 that are not in Windows 8, and I decided to port some of them. And then there are some additional helper classes that help with building Windows 8 applications, and there are some XAML debugging tools. So, since we have two versions of Windows 8 now, Windows 8 and Windows 8.1, I actually have two versions of that toolkit that share almost all of the code, but have some slight differences, and I'll probably be adding some more features to the Windows 8.1 version, since there are some nice new features in Windows 8.1, including I think my favorite favorite class being the render target bitmap, which is an image source or a bitmap that you can use to render your visual tree to a bitmap that you can then duplicate on the screen and get some really nice effects. So this is the Windows 8 version of the application. The application is actually a list of samples or tests that show how you can use the controls and the helpers from the toolkit. So I won't go and show all of them, but I would like to show some of them and talk about them a little bit. So maybe I'll go alphabetically, and the first one is AlternativeFrame. So there's a frame class in Windows 8 that you can use to navigate back and forth between pages in your UI. And at some point, I decided that I want to do a control that does transitions between pages that aren't just fade out, fade in, but allow you to see both pages or crossfade between pages. And this control actually allows you to do that. So it has almost the same API surface as the frame, but it has all these nice or random transitions that you can do, slides and wipes and flips of pages when you navigate from one to another. Another feature that it has is actually you can preload the next page that you want to open. So, for example, if you have a page that you're planning to open next, or the user will probably open next, because right now you're on a hub page, and next the user will most likely go to a page that has lots of images, and you roughly expect that this is going to be the page. So it actually preloads the page that you say is likely to be loaded next. So when I click here, it has the page with lots of images that have been loaded when I was talking to you. So that's AlternativeFrame. You can grab that control from the toolkit, and you can use AlternativeFrame and define your own transitions. And if you need any help, you can always talk to me. Another one as a sample is a calendar control. This is direct port from Silverlight Toolkit. So there's no calendar control in Windows 8. And I think Windows 8.1 also doesn't have it out of the box. There's also only like a date picker and time picker control. So if you need to display a calendar, you have this control here. I modified the template a little bit to be more touch-friendly, so you can use it in an application. Another one is a camera capture control. So in Windows 8, you have this nice launcher called Camera Capture UI, and you can use that to to show a preview of from the camera and start recording or taking pictures and record videos or pictures. But the problem is that it's full screen, and this goes nicely with the Microsoft design language, where you want to have focus on the task that you're doing. So if you're recording a video, you want to do it on full screen. But there are some scenarios where you actually want to do that inside of your application. So the camera capture control is actually a control that helps you with that. So I can hide and show the preview inside of the application. I could take a picture. There's actually a countdown control that was used here to take a picture. So you can see it counting down here from 3 to 0 and then taking a picture. And you can record, and then it plays back that recording. So I can do something here, and it shows that recording that it did. So that helps you if you want to work with video or pictures. The next one is a kind of example of what you can do with XAML. So it's Cascading Image Control, which just has this interesting transition when it shows up. It's one of the, I call them quirky controls that don't serve a big purpose, but they're kind of flashy. A similar one is, let me find that. Cascading Text Block is the next one. So this one actually has this text that shows up and rotates while it's falling. I can change some properties here. So it rotates more. So it falls and rotates. And you can type in any text here. So I can say hello Apex Fest. And the next time it loads, it will actually be hello Apex Fest. So another one that's probably the most popular control from the toolkit is the port of the chart control from Silverlight Toolkit. And it has various ways of presenting your data. And it's one of the very few charting controls for Windows 8 right now. And there are lots of samples here for what types of charts you can implement with it. They're all slightly modified to look better on Windows 8. This entire toolkit is, my open source project that I do work on in my free time, and I don't always have the time to finish everything. But one of the things I started working on was a color picker. So there's actually this page here that's called color picker primitives, and it's not showing up so nicely because I haven't finished working on it. But it shows a lot of the code that is in the toolkit for working with colors. So there are helpers that help you convert colors between RGB, HSL, and HSV color spaces. And these tools are actually used to render this color ring and color triangle and these bars. So all of these use some helper libraries that help you, helper APIs that make it really easy to render these color picker selectors. So depending on your requirements, if you're building the next paint application that's maybe a competitor to Fresh Paint, you could use these components to select colors. One of the controls that I really like is the custom grid splitter, which there's a grid splitter control in WPF. That's not there in Windows 8 because, well, grid splitters don't go so well with Windows Design Language or Microsoft Design Language. But there are many cases when they're actually pretty useful, especially when you're building tools or you want to have a UI that's slightly more flexible. So that grid splitter is roughly the same as the one in WPF in terms of APIs. It's just the default template is more geared towards touch, so I can actually easily find that control with touch and move it with touch. One control that someone actually contributed to the toolkit recently is called gauge control. It allows you to show values like a gauge on hydraulics or inside of a car, which is a nice way to represent some types of data. It was actually designed by Arturo Toledo, who was one of the designers at Microsoft. I think he worked on the Windows Phone team. There's an image button control, which is something that you should probably take a look at if you're building an application that's rich in pictures and you want to have highly customized buttons that have different states represented by images. So a button typically has like 3 or 4 states, which is like normal, pressed, and hover states. So that control allows you to easily specify multiple pictures that are going to be used to represent that image without retemplating it. And also, if you don't have all of these images, it will actually give you options to automatically generate some of the images. So I think one of these images, so this control actually has just one image specified for the neutral state. But if you hover, it actually generates another picture that's kind of semi-transparent. It's more whitish. And then when it's in the press state, it's even more white. Another one is actually it generates disabled state. There are some image processing algorithms in the toolkit that automatically make the picture grayscale. So it automatically generates a disabled state button for you. There's also a toggle button version of that, so it has all these states, and you can define them either with images or some parameters that make these images, grayscale or some sort of lighter shade. Another one that's ported from Silverlight Toolkit is layout transform control. So if you used WPF before, there's a render transform and layout transform property on the XAML element. And you can use render transform to kind of independently rotate or scale or transform otherwise a control. But there's also a layout transform property that automatically makes space for that resized control that you have. So that layout transform wasn't implemented in Silverlight or in Windows 8, but Silverlight Toolkit had this implementation of a layout transform control, in which you can specify a transformation, and it will automatically scale that control and resize it so it actually fits. So if you, for example, have a text block that you want to show rotated 90 degrees, it makes it really easily doable for you. You just put that button inside of this control, specify the transform, and that text block shouldn't get clipped in any way, and a space will be made available to it using the layout algorithms of the platform. There's a ring slice and pie slice control, which you can use to show data, or maybe implement a slider control that looks like a ring or pie slice. A numeric up-down control, which is slightly different from numeric up-down controls of Windows Forms or WPF, in that it actually is geared not towards decimal values and the currency, but more towards floating point value entering. And it works in a similar way to the sliders in Blend, in that you can do plus and minus to decrease and increase values, but you can also start dragging on top of it, and just by dragging in any direction, you can reduce and increase the value that's entered. And you can also click and enter that value manually with keyboard. I'll get to that again later. There's a TreeView Control, which is also ported from the Silverlight Toolkit, and it has a touch template and a mouse template, depending on what you want to use it for. So that's another one. Uniform Grid is actually a contribution, and I've been playing with it a little bit here. There's some sort of an animation that transforms all of these elements and puts them in a circle, and they rotate, and they're sorted based on the HSL color values. So it shows quite a few features of the framework if you look at the source code, which is available on Codeplex. There's a Watermark password box and Watermark text box, and Windows 8.1 actually adds these new properties that allow you to specify a placeholder text on the text control. And in Windows 8.0, there wasn't that feature, so I implemented this control, which works like a password box, but you can define a watermark text. And also, what you can't do in Windows 8.1 is you can actually define any content as a watermark. So you can put an image or a shape, and this is one sample that shows it, that you can put this arrow shape here inside of it as a placeholder text. So if you want to prompt the user to do something, you can specify that, and someone might enter something there. Watermark Text Box works similar way. A web browser is something that you can do if you really want to have a web browser inside of your application. So there are ways to actually launch Internet Explorer or a default browser outside of the application, but there might be cases where you might actually host it inside of the application. So it's not a very super robust, because I've never actually used it in a shipping application, but you can type stuff in, and it actually by default navigates to the WinRT XAML Toolkit page on Codeplex. I can navigate to Bing. Oops, colors are not set correctly, but it shows the web browser, and it has the all the UI that you need to enter the address. There might be cases where you'd want to use that. For example, if you want to use some custom bookmarking of your pages. So, for example, if you want to do some integration with Instapaper, or save your bookmarks somewhere onto SkyDrive and use some custom logic, then you can host a web browser control in your application. So these are the controls, but controls aren't the only thing in the toolkit. There's also lots of extensions. There's an implementation of the behaviors API, which the Blend team, I think, shipped before for WPF and Silverlight. I won't go through all of these right now, but for example, highlight behavior is something that might be pretty useful if you do search over text in your application. You can type in some text, and there's a simple property applied to that text block below that actually highlights the text. So I can type in a text here, and it highlights that text inside of the text block. What else? There's a TextBox validation. So if you need to enter some values, there are some simple APIs that allow you to validate the values that need to be entered. For example, this field is set to be non-empty, and if it's empty, it shows in a different color. This one needs to be non-empty and numeric. So you can specify different error messages that show up when these parameters are not met. There's another one for strong password, which is kind of arbitrary, but it requires at least 8 characters and lowercase and uppercase and the number and the special character to be entered. So lots of interesting features that you can use if you have an application where you have to enter data, and any sort of, I think, enterprise application might make use of these. There are some simple APIs that you can use to fade in or fade out controls with a simple single method. Image extensions allow you to specify that an image control should fade in or somehow other transition once the image loads. So if you have images that go from the web, you specify that single property on your image, and that image fades in or slides in or does something interesting when it shows. So you can have some placeholder image showing up before your actual image is loaded. A lot of these extensions are actually a little bit difficult to demo without looking at the code, which I want to show also in a moment. So I will quickly jump through them. But animated scroll is another feature that is not available in a scroll viewer in Windows 8.0, but Windows 8.1 actually adds that feature. So it almost makes my toolkit unuseful for Windows 8.1 with a small caveat that you can actually await that scrolling to complete. So you basically call await scroll to a certain position, and that await method returns when that scrolling is complete. And there are lots of scenarios where you might want to do that. For example, if you have lots of text entered in a text box, and at some point you want to animate to the end of that text, and only after you animate to the end of that text you want some other animation to play, then you can use that extension. There are lots of helpers that help with images here. There's actually an imaging helpers section which shows another part of the toolkit which allows you to render your UI to a bitmap. In Windows 8.0, it uses SharpDX and DirectX and Direct2D to render your UI to a control. It actually imitates what Windows does when rendering stuff on screen. It just does it into a texture and saves it into a writable bitmap. It's not perfect. There are some lots of things are not implemented, so it's good for very basic stuff, but you can use that right now for your Windows 8.0 application. For example, if you want to render a custom tile with some text on top of it and with some shapes, you can use it to render that tile. Right now it's kind of hard because you have the option to either use writable bitmap where you control each pixel separately, or you have to use SharpDX or DirectX yourself and use learn DirectX if you don't know it. With this control, you can just create that UI using XAML and render the UI to a writable bitmap. And there's another helper that makes it really easy to write that writable bitmap to an image, and then you can, render a live tile that has text and rich content. So I believe the most useful feature of this entire toolkit, and something that I'm focusing on right now, is the visual tree debugger, which I might have shown you before. But there's this concept of a visual tree debugger that I think first showed up with WPF. And there's still a very popular tool for that called Snoop, which you can use to debug any WPF application and see what UI elements are where, and navigate the entire visual tree, search for things, filter what things are shown, and use PowerShell to run some scripts over a UI of an application, even if it's not your application actually. There's another tool that was created that's a commercial tool for Silverlight, and it was called Silverlight Spy, which does a similar thing. And there's a new version called XAML Spy right now, which works with WPF and Silverlight and Windows Phone and Windows 8. But that's a commercial product, and it costs, I think, at least $100 to use it. So this is an open source version that you can use for free, and there's a limitation that you might call a limitation, but it also might be a feature that it's actually implemented to show and render as part of your own UI. So there's a pop-up here that shows up inside of the application, and you can use these grid splitters that I used elsewhere, and TreeView Control that I specifically ported from a Silverlight toolkit to actually implement that control here. And I basically hover with my mouse on top of some UI element, like this button here, press Ctrl-Shift, and that control gets selected in that tree. And I can see where it is actually defined in the application. So it actually lists all the properties categorized and grouped in different categories. There are filters here, so by default it doesn't show properties for a control that weren't specified manually. So if something's unchanged, it doesn't show it. So I can see that the foreground is specified for that button, and I can actually go and make that button red. Actually, no, that's not the right one, but I can say that this one should be red. Yep, not the one. Oh, yep. So that right now the control got yellow because I typed in the RGB values that define that the control should be yellow. You can also open an image and make that background be an image. So if I want to test some theory for the design, it actually loads that image as the foreground brush for that button. So I have various filters here. One is I can show the properties ungrouped. I can make it show all the properties, including the read-only properties, so I can see what the actual height of an element is. So sometimes it's hard to see what the actual size of a control will be inside of the application, and it's a little bit difficult to debug it. And you can use the designer view for your controls, but you might not always see what the size will be inside of the application. So you can check actual height and actual width of the control in using that toolkit. You can search, so you can enter margin, and margin shows up, and I can move the control. And actually, right now you can see that if I move it further, it disappears. So sometimes problems when working with XAML are that some control has a clip property specified, or something has opacity specified to 0, or visibility set to 0, and you're not always sure what the reason is that your control doesn't show up. So you can use that visual tree to find the control. You know that it's in debug TreeView test page, and you know that it's in the third grid in a row, and it has a specific name, and you find that, and you wonder why it's not showing up. And then you look at it, and you can see that maybe the opacity is set to 0, so it's a type opacity, and no, it's not 0, it's 1. You can look at the other controls up the stack and see that all of them actually have opacity set to 1, but you select it and you can see that that highlight rectangle here, it's kind of shifted, so you might see, oh, maybe it's mispositioned. So type in margin, and you can modify that margin and see that it actually got clipped by a clip property on some of the elements where it was hosted in. So there's also a filter that's kind of built in right now, which if I only disable that typed in filter, there's a filter that shows properties that are likely to alter your layout. So it has a list of properties that most likely cause an element not showing up. So there are padding, render transform, maximum height and width properties. So I can specify maximum height somewhere to 5, and that control will never show up because maximum height actually overrides any value specified by width, height, or another layout properties. I can reset that and go back to the original value. So I can go elsewhere in the application and press Ctrl-Shift elsewhere, and it refreshes automatically, and you can see the other parameters that control the positioning of the control. And yeah, this list right now shows all the properties that might affect layout. So I can collapse it. And there's also another feature in debugging here that you can show a debug trace inside of the application, which is sometimes useful. Like for me, when I only have one laptop with one screen, I don't have a secondary screen to look at logging, and I want to debug some interactivity code. So I move my mouse on top of the control, and I want to see what the properties are of the pointer events. I can I can trace them and show them inside of the application, so I can have a quick look at what's happening. And it actually supports any text, and you can easily hook up to that and use it as easily as you use debug write line today for printf debugging. You can fade that out, and you can make it actually so that you can it's not hit as visible, so you can interact with your UI through that trace information screen. So there's also a version of that toolkit that I have for Windows 8.1, and to test things out a little bit, I changed the default theme there to a light theme, so all the controls are here, and they render in light theme as well as they do in dark theme, most of them. So that's a complaint that I've seen from a lot of people who were using the toolkit, that some controls weren't supporting different themes, and right now that's built in. Miscellaneous, there's a web file helper class that allows you to very easily, with one line command, download a file from a URI. So you specify a URI, like the current Bing image of the day, and with one call it saves it to a file on your local drive, and automatically figures out what the name of the original file was on the server, getting it from HTTP headers, and does a lot of stuff for you, so you can use that. And maybe let me show you some demos of what you can do with the toolkit and how you can use that. So I have Visual Studio 2012 here, so I'll do a Windows 8 project. I'll start with maybe with a grid application, and I'll show you first how to do the debugging. Default grid application template has some UI in it already, so it should be pretty good to debug and modify. So I go to Manage NuGet Packages and the project. I look at NuGet official package source, and I look for WinRT XAML Toolkit. So there's a few packages here. I broke things down a little bit because the toolkit started growing a little bit large, and it became a little bit hard to download. And the debugging tools is something that I use every day now. It's been almost 1,000 downloads so far, and 11,000 downloads for the WinRT XAML Toolkit. So people in the community seem to be using it a little bit. Let me install the debugging components. Okay, done. So I think the default page when the application starts is the grouped items page. So the best way to put that hook in is actually wait for the loaded event. And now I just type in DC and hit Alt-Enter. If I use ReSharper, if you don't have ReSharper, you can do Alt-Shift-F10, and it automatically adds the reference for you. So using WinRT XAML Toolkit debugging, and I just do show visual tree this. And this is the only... Sorry?
What does DC stand for?
Debug Console. So there's actually a class fully called Debug Console, and DC is another class that's just a proxy to that, so it's easier to type. I was using XAML Spy with my toolkit a little bit, and found that it takes a little bit much work to actually hook it up. So I wanted to make it as painless as possible to use my toolkit and debugger to debug the application. So yeah, the debugger is here. I can debug this. I can debug that. I can move things around. If my designer comes up and tells me that this is 5 pixels too much or too little, and then we can quickly change it inside of the application, and we don't have to rely on blend and specifying, using MVVM and sample data or anything. We just run the toolkit, run the debugging tools, and you can modify things at runtime. Things disappear. You can see how much you need to move something so that you'll get 2 rows of data instead of 1 row of data, and you can do all that at runtime.
What happens if you modify so many things and then you want to, I got exactly what I want. How do you convert that?
Yeah, so right now you have to take notes. But yes, one of the things that I'm planning, and I might do it in the next few weeks, is to actually record which controls were modified and give you a list of things that were modified. I think more would take more work. But it certainly might be possible to generate a style that overrides your style you have currently, or I have ideas for creating animations automatically using that Visual Tree debugger, and dragging things around on the screen with just your touch. You press Control and something, and you will move something on the screen and save that as an animation, for example. So there are lots of interesting things that you can do once you have an open source project and you control the source. So let me actually do maybe a Windows 8.1 application, and I'll show you some of the things that I do with the toolkit. Okay, so I have a basic application. Let's see. So one of the libraries inside of my toolkit is called AwayUI. And what it does is there are various things in UI development that are not like things that you load something from your hard drive or load something from the network or from the database, but still might take a while to perform. So, for example, you might run an animation, and you might want to run something that that's run only after the animation is completed. So the awaitable UI library in my toolkit actually allows you to await various events in UI. So I'll try to show you quickly how to do that. Get official package source, WinRT XAML Toolkit. Okay, so I installed the toolkit, and so I have an empty page, and maybe I'll make it into a canvas, and actually let me quickly switch to blend, because if I'm going to create an animation, then it's best to use blend for animations. I can type that in XAML or in code behind, but it should be a lot easier with blend. So let me quickly switch. Okay, that's my page in blend. I look for an ellipse. I put that ellipse over here. I create a new storyboard. Storyboard 1. I move the ellipse, and I want it at 1 second to move here. And then I want to create a new storyboard that moves the ellipse here, for example. And I'll put some button here. And I think, yeah, let me see if that animation works. So the ellipse works, it animates, the ellipse moves here. Okay, so I have 2 storyboards. I save that. I can go back to Visual Studio. I have the storyboards. And now what I want to do is when the page loads, I want to start something. Yep. Oh, I forgot I don't have ReSharper in Windows 8.1 yet. So I'll make it async. So I have that storyboard. Oh, I thought I have it. Storyboard 1. Oh, maybe it just doesn't know that it's there. And usually a storyboard you run with begin, but this one you can run with begin async. I just have to reference the WinRT XAML Toolkit, awaitable UI. And now I can await a storyboard. And then I can await a message dialog. And I can await another storyboard. Oh. And let's see if that works. I think that hello needs to go there. Yep. I think, is it show async? Yep. So the standard is that anything that is awaitable should be called async. So the page loads, you get that dialog. We are awaiting that dialog. When I press close, it runs the other animation. So that's one thing that you can do with the message dialog, but you can also do it differently. You can await await a button click. So do wait for click async. That's what the name is of the method. So now I don't have any events that I'm actually specifying, but I can build some sort of wizard that goes further after I click something, and I do all of that using structured code. I don't have to specify any events, and if there's some sequence that's fairly rigid and there's not going to be anything that breaks it, I can do things in like 4 lines of code that usually would take me 5 event subscriptions and then handlers and stuff. And right now it's just 4 lines of code. So let's take a look at how you can get to that other than NuGet. So there's this page on CodePlex called WinRT XAML Toolkit.codeplex.com. And if you go to source code, there's all the source code. I use Git with that, so you can clone that with Git, or you can download it. If you hit download, you'll get the zip package with all the source code in the current version, and that's something that you might want to do if you want to look how to actually use all of these controls that I showed. I have so you can save the zip file. Right now I have a solution opened here. This is the 8.0 solution. I have 3 solutions, one for 0.0, one for 0.1, and one for everything, depending on what you want to do. I'll walk you through the structure of the project. So there are projects for various groups of features. The toolkit has most of the code right now. The composition hosts the composition engine, which is used to render the visual tree to a bitmap, which uses sharpdx, so it's actually extracted separately because sharpdx is a little bit heavy to load. So if you don't want to load 6 various libraries, you don't have to use it. The Silverlight Toolkit's calendar and Silverlight Toolkit's charts are pretty hefty controls, so they have their own libraries here. There's a gauge control, which has a separate library. The debugging stuff, actually, this is the only part that when you get it from NuGet, it's compiled as a debug binary, so you won't ship that into the store because the store doesn't accept anything compiled with debug. All of the other libraries on NuGet are compiled as release. The reason debugging is compiled as debug is you probably don't want that code shipped in your application. You only add that one line of code if you want to debug it, and then you want to remove it. And also, there are actually attributes specified in various methods in there that make it only run in debug builds. So you don't actually have to disable it if you include the source code of the debugging library with your project, and you want to quickly build the release build. You don't have to remove all the tracing hooks from your code. The sample is actually what I was showing, which had all the sample code for various controls and extensions. So it's using MVVM, and it has a few view models where it was necessary, but I tried to make it as simple as possible. So so you have simple hookups to all of these controls. So you go to gauge test page and look how it's done, and there's a grid and various gauges with various parameters specified. So you can actually see if you need to define your custom template to get that look of the gauge control, or if you just can specify a few properties. And in the case of a gauge control, there's a needle brush color and trail brush color and so on that you can change. And the chart is the biggest control in there so far, and it actually there's a flip view with different sample of the chart for each page. And some of these have been restyled, they're retemplated, and there are different data series definitions. So a column series and a column chart, and bar series and bar chart. So you can see how it's all done by looking at the source code in the sample. There's also another application here that I can show you that's sometimes useful, although maybe it will be a little bit less useful with Windows 8.1 and Visual Studio 2013, but it basically visualizes a lot of the standard brushes and up bar button styles, for example, and you can copy and paste these names from this application. Just go through all the available styles for application bar buttons and text block styles. You can see which ones are bigger and which might fit your requirements, so you don't have to define your own styles if they're already shipping out of the box. So if you have any skills in XAML, I would actually also ask if you want to contribute, if you have some controls that are interesting that you might want to share with the community. I think working with open source is really rewarding. I really learned a ton about development and made myself really easy to hire right now by knowing a lot of stuff about XAML. It seems like there's just really tons of work for XAML developers right now, and lots of teams at Microsoft are hiring. So when I came back to Microsoft 3 months ago, there were five teams that were looking for XAML developers that reached out to me, and I could pick and choose, and FreshPaint was the most interesting one. And basically working with this in your free time gives you an opportunity to learn and work with anything that you like to do and not necessarily something that you do for work. But also, a lot of the things that I've done here were driven by things that I wanted to do at work. So For example, I worked on a Disney princess application for Disney, and I found that I needed a lot of things that were missing in the platform, and I didn't have time to build reusable controls at work, but I had a long commute, and on the bus home, I usually spent some time to make things reusable, and I created controls that I later used in the application. And also, the debugging controls I used at work all the time, and it's really a good experience doing something that you like in your free time that you can then use at work and be rewarded for it. Yeah, so I think that's it for me. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and take plenty of time. We've got plenty of time. So
yeah, if you want me to demo something else, how you use some of these features, I can do that for you.
How does working with open source jive with LCA? How do you arrange that?
So as long as it's, I believe that as long as it doesn't compete with anything that you do at work, or it doesn't taint you, it shouldn't be a big problem. So most of the code that's in my toolkit was written by myself, or was using code from Microsoft. So it's not a big problem for me. I think you can just ask your LCA about that, but usually it's not a very big problem, and lots of people at Microsoft do open source development in their free time, and some of them build libraries that millions of people use outside of Microsoft.
I'm also wondering about open source. I've never worked with an open source project, and you mentioned you learned a lot, and so I'm just curious, how does that come about? Like, why did an open source project allow you to learn more than
So one thing is just that you play with things that you want to do, and not necessarily things that you have to do at work. So maybe at work you do HTML, and you want to learn XAML, and you can do that in your free time. You can build your own application, and that's certainly something that you can ship to the store and not make it open source. But building something that other people might want to do, and something that you might want to reuse in the future, like a library or a toolkit like mine, you learn a lot of things about architecting software. You learn to work with people, with a community. You expose your code to criticism, and you get bug reports, and you can be the master of your own project, and which is not something that you always get at Microsoft. So I think a lot of that feedback from the community is something that helps you learn. Well, basically the things that you can experiment, and you have freedom to do whatever you want, is something that's really beneficial. And I think it's rewarding just that I hear a lot from people who use the toolkit that they thank me because I made available these awesome features here and there, and this is the only charting toolkit for Windows 8, and now they could create that application. And I've seen some applications like I think Hulu or Twitter official applications for Windows using my toolkit. And there are, I think, tons of other applications that use various parts of it, and I think that's really motivating. I think before I started working with open source, I was playing a lot of games in my free time, and now I don't have time to play games anymore because I have such a fun time, writing code, and actually that makes me, I think, also a better developer at work because I have more experience. I double my time, programming, and at work you might be doing things that are not necessarily as fun as you would like to, but if you do open source, you can come up with some interesting theories, and maybe you come up with some ideas that maybe you can use at work. maybe that they will help you at work, or maybe you can share it with other people, and they might make you famous, or they might give you just the joy of working with other people. And there's tons of benefits if you become very familiar with some topic. Can you hear the question?
So can you use the Debug Console in C++ project?
No, unfortunately, all of these libraries are .NET, and they're not WinRT components. And originally, I was just not very familiar what's the difference between a WinRT component library and a class library. But I mostly saw limitations in WinRT components. So you can create a library for Windows 8 applications with C# in two different ways. One is a class library, and that can only be used in .NET applications. And you can create a WinRT component, which looks roughly the same, and there's actually, you can just go to project properties, and there's, maybe I'll stop it. There's this output type parameter. You can easily change your project between Windows Store app, class library, and Windows runtime component. But the problem with WinRT components is that they impose lots of limitations on you. So you can't have, I think you can't expose your controls or your classes, making them inheritable. You have to have everything sealed. I think you can't share, I don't remember all of the limitations, but maybe like interfaces aren't available, or you can't expose things as structs, or you can't expose anything that isn't sealed. So my toolkit wouldn't be extensible that way. And yeah. So for example, one of the features I have is a behavior class. So you can easily add your own behaviors to controls. But a behavior you have to derive from my base behavior class, and you wouldn't be able to do that if you had a WinRT component, right? So actually, maybe I'd like to show one more thing.
Are you aware of a technical reason why they do that? Is that for performance, or is why would they do that? Why would they
I think it's just a part of the WinRT lower level framework. So WinRT in its base, I think, is based on COM. I'm not sure if COM allows for inheritance. It basically is based on interfaces, and I think.
That has to be projected.
Yeah, it has to be projected to other languages that work differently. So I think maybe in the future WinRT types will and WinRT components will allow for anything that .NET applications allow for right now. But if you expose link query results, for example, outside of your application, that would have to be projected to all the other languages, and maybe they don't understand that programming language structure paradigm. So, yeah. So WinRT components, if I created it as a WinRT component, you could use that in C++, and in theory, you could use that in JavaScript as well, but since all of my code is heavily related to XAML, well, there's no point in doing that with JavaScript. And I actually haven't seen many people doing XAML development with C++ either. So there wouldn't be so much return from that. Although a lot of that code should probably, if you extract it into a WinRT component library, it should be possible to make it a WinRT component fairly easily. It's just that it requires more work, and I'm just one guy. Someone else had a question?
I was just going to say that my group is C++. Debug Console.
Yeah. So, yeah, C++ is possible to use, and I think for XAML you can certainly use that, and there are cases where it helps. But I think if you're a C# developer and developing applications in C# is probably a little bit easier and faster, and code is easier to maintain. I would actually not recommend using C++ for XAML development. And I do recommend using C++ though if you have anything that does heavy processing, or like if you need to use DirectX, that's a good idea. Although even with DirectX today, you can use sharpdx, which makes it a lot easier to work with DirectX if you don't know C++ well. I've used XAML with DirectX using both C++ and sharpdx, and there are benefits to both methods. So with C++, you have problems with using another language, and C++ is definitely more difficult to program and maintain that than C#. But you can create a WinRT component with C++, and that might be reusable whether it's a C++ or C# application. And also for C++, you have all the samples in the DirectX SDK, and you can use like C++ AMP if you want to do something really quick with GPU, and it gives you lots of power. But I think if you build a Windows Store application, I wouldn't really recommend that unless you don't know C# and you're very skilled with C++, which is still probably, I'm sure, lots of people doing C++, but I think a lot of people at Microsoft are C# developers, and it's just easier. With sharpdx, there's less documentation, but you can just compile for any CPU, and that's actually one problem that I've seen with using C# and C++ together, that usually you have to create a separate package for each platform. So for ARM and x86 and x64, you have to create separate versions. So it's also difficult to create a reusable library that you would want to use with different C# projects, because you need different versions of that library, and I'm actually not sure how to build a C# application with a compiled C++ library if you have separate versions of that library for different platforms. You probably need to use like an extensions SDK or something like that. So I just remembered one thing that I haven't shown you, so maybe I can quickly go there. There's controls extensions, groups of samples in there that show you how to use some of these extensions in the toolkit. And I only showed you what they look like once you run them, but I thought maybe it would be nice to show you how to actually use them. So for example, let's go to highlight behavior. So here, you can implement it in different ways. I have this search string box where I entered some text, and I could update and regenerate that text block underneath with the highlighted stuff. But if you go to, what is it called? Highlight behavior. I think it's actually here. If you go here, you can find that there's one text box that has the search text. There's another one that has the search string, and the only thing that you have to do to highlight that text is just define these few lines of code to use that behavior that I have for highlighting it. that's using a behavior that's similar in its implementation to Blend behaviors. So Blend, the 2013 version with the Blend SDK is supposed to have this new implementation of behaviors. So they are really easy to apply in Blend. And that was the goal of this library. But there's also another set of behaviors that's defined as a basic attached behavior pattern. So so in some cases of these extensions, I define them just as attached properties. So for example, there's this framework element extension system cursor property that's just one property here that you define, and you set it to some enum value like arrow or cross. And if you go to I think it's this one, I specify a different cursor for each of these controls by just specifying these one line of code, one attribute. And underneath there's actually a class that attaches to that control and handles pointer events, pointer entering that control and leaving the control and setting the system cursor. Right now there's no built-in API in Windows 8 for changing the cursor automatically for a specific control. You can only change the cursor for your application or for the OS. So this gives you a way to specify that I want to hand the cursor for my PDF viewer when users can pan with their mouse on the screen. So WinRT has a lot of these controls that are created primarily for use with touch, but a lot of the things that you might want to do to support keyboard and mouse, which Microsoft used to require from all applications in the store, are actually not so easy to implement, and a lot of these extensions help with that. So actually, let's show one more thing. So show TextBox validation. I can find that. Oh well, maybe I don't have a sample for it. But there are some extensions here that make the text automatically, a text box automatically select the text when you enter the control. Or, for example, when your text box only supports 3 character because it's area code for your telephone. There's an extension that says that after the control has been filled with this number of characters, it will automatically skip to the next field. So it has lots of that support for keyboard input, and the TreeView Control and the grid splitter are all created to support all these mouse input scenarios, which are not so easy with the out-of-the-box APIs. If you want to look at more things, there's an extension that helps make a list view item disabled, just one item in the list through binding. There's another one that allows you to specify that you want some specific item to be brought into view in a list view with a bindable property. So if you use MVVM, you can say that, oh, I want this item to show on the screen right now. So you basically set that item in list view item extensions to bring into view, and I select the item here, and just with one attribute somewhere in code, it gets brought into view here. There's another set that allows to bind a list of selected items. So if you use MVVM and you want to control the list of items selected in the list, there's a helper for that. You have bindable selection, and my source list has a selected items or bindable selections property, and I have another list that binds to that collection here. So you can, I invite you to explore things that are there. A lot of these features were also driven by me scouring the Stack Overflow website for interesting questions on WinRT. So sometimes I saw a question like, how do I do that? And I think, well, it is difficult in WinRT, and well, maybe I can create some reusable method or extension that you might use, and then I create that, I put that in the toolkit, and many people on Stack Overflow go back to that question, and I want to highlight some text in my text block when I do a search in the application, and they find a link to my library, and that's where they get. So if you looked for some solutions to problems online, it's likely that you found links leading to my toolkit. And if not there, then there's another toolkit from Tim Hewer from the Windows team, who has other controls that you might have seen missing in Windows 8.0, although a lot of his controls are now implemented in Windows 8.1, so it will be less usable, but his is probably the most popular control toolkit for Windows 8. Friend other helpers. Any more questions? Okay.